So this afternoon, I am delighted to introduce Dianne Gereluk. She is the Dean and Professor at the Worklund, is that how you say it? Worklund School of Education, University of Calgary. So we're really privileged that she's been able to come over from Canada. And her research focuses on the normative dimensions of educational policy and practice, particularly concerning politically contested and controversial education issues. She's dedicated to exploring how educators can foster environments conducive to constructive political deliberation in today's polarised civil society. Oh my word, isn't that topical? Dr. Gereluk's scholarly inquiries have delved into various political controversies in educational settings, including, but not limited to, gun violence, gender and sexual identity, and youth radicalization. At the core of her philosophical work is her commitment to fostering learning environments for children to learn how to live well together in society despite their diverse, fundamental, political, social and religious perspectives. So please, can you put your hands together to welcome Dianne?
I just want to say thank you so much for that kind introduction. It really is a pleasure to be here today, and I've already participated in so many wonderful and vibrant and substantive discussions. I do want to extend my gratitude to the British Educational Research Association for the invitation. And as someone who spent nearly a decade living and working here as an early scholar, and who holds dual citizenship, I will say, England and Canada, UK has always felt like a second home to me. And like all good second homes, it offers both deep comfort and the occasional necessary nudge towards growth and prosperity. So I am going to have some provocations today, which will spur, it's an easy topic today, spur a lively debate here. Now, I imagine, as you see, if you glanced at my title today, From Surveillance to Empowerment, and you probably thought, oh, good, an uplifting talk before we get to the reception and have a drink. So I wanted to say thank you in advance for your openness and your willingness to come here today. And I'm going to start with a little bit more personal. I think it's always important to give a little bit of context about why I came to this work and why I think schools are not just peripheral players in these conversations, but absolutely central. So as an educator and a researcher, I've always been drawn to the question of how schools help young people learn to live well together, not just coexist, but truly understand one another across difference and appreciating how we can do this together. And while that sounds like a lofty ideal, I'd argue that there's nothing more urgent in our current climate, because we are witnessing what many have called a crisis of belonging, of trust, an increase in polarization, misinformation, and we see this across our respective institutions and organizations, and arguably we see this with each other. Now, when I first started studying educational responses to terrorism, this was in the early 2000s, and I was a beginning scholar at Roehampton. So my Roehampton peeps, it's good to see you here. After 9/11 and 7/7. And I do remember walking into the lecture halls and observing some of the newspaper articles that were popping up in various key news outlets, where teachers were really navigating some incredibly difficult issues with very little guidance. Some were handed bizarre lesson plans and then taken away very quickly. Very few were given space or permission to invite their students into a deeper, critical, thoughtful reflection and dialogue. In fact, if start to telling my age when I was only 6, I recall that on one of the A-level exams, and it actually kind of made the news, students were asked to write whether the war in Afghanistan was justified, when arguably few teachers had really discussed it substantively in their classrooms. And both teachers and pupils, appeared to be taken off guard by the exam prompt. Now, the United States was not much better. In fact, it's kind of bizarre. They had some really bizarre things that they were doing. They focused on heroism, the firefighters, the volunteers, the boots by the church. They actually never talked about the event, but they had all these patriotic symbols, right? Flags going up in their homes. And they had this urgency to do something, to display both their grief and their solidarity as a nation. And so we saw a lot of these symbolic gestures. And some individuals felt the obligation and urgency to join the army as their patriotic duty. And at a farcical level, if you do recall, this is over 20 years ago, terminology to show allegiance or resistance was notable with the changing of French fries to freedom fries to show opposition to the French government's stance on Iraq. And the veil of unity across political divisions was intended to create a sense of belonging and agreement. Yet, in doing so, it created a number of problems. I'll mention two right now. First was those who had wished to challenge such unity felt excluded, marginalized, and targeted by the dominant narratives that were occurring. And it lessened the ability to actually have deliberative conversations about what was happening and what had led to these events and how to best move forward with these students. Now, fast forward 2 decades and some things have changed, but I'm going to argue much has not. Today, under the Prevent Duty, teachers in the UK are asked not only to educate, but to detect risk, to become, in essence, frontline workers in the fight against terrorism. And that's a lot. Frankly, that's more than a lot, and we didn't sign up for that. Now, most in this room do know about the Prevent Duty, but for those that may not be in the UK, if you're also an international scholar or a researcher, I'll briefly explain it just so everyone's kind of on the same page here. So in 2015, the United Kingdom's Counter-Terrorism and Security Act imposed the Prevent Duty, quote, a duty on schools to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. So this assigns a teacher a professional responsibility to help children and youth understand the risks associated with terrorism and to develop the knowledge and skills to be able to challenge extremist arguments. The further emphasis on the Prevent Duty is a custodial task for teachers to observe children, be attentive to behavioral changes, identify those at risk of radicalization, and potentially refer them for external assessment and support. And that's a heavy ask, especially when the tools provided are at best ambiguous, and I would say ethically troubling. And the research, it paints a complicated picture. Studies by scholars like Lee Jerome and Alex Elwick's study reveal a troubling pattern. Prevent has disproportionately focused on Islamophobia, Britishness, and safeguarding. And educators report uncertainty about when to intervene, what signs to look for, and how to navigate deeply sensitive conversations without clear guidance or support. The result is an inconsistent patchwork of practice, well-intentioned if you want to give a charitable read on this, but often lacking coherence or fairness. And the challenge of identifying changing behaviors among students as they relate to radicalization is an unrealistic and unfair burden to be placed on teachers. At best, it requires a level of training or guidance or building their capacities and expertise to properly identify troubling behaviors. And at worst, it may cause further stigmatization, discrimination, and loss of trust among already arguably marginalized students. Now, to illustrate the problem, I'm going to take a parallel example with this approach, this kind of identifying and reporting approach. And it's a common legal duty across our respective jurisdictions. And that's the duty to report for abuse or neglect. Teachers' duty to report is a long-standing legal requirement, yet there is hesitancy to do so. And there's lots of studies. I'm going to focus on a Merrick one just to illustrate the point here. So in the United States, there was this large study that's conducted, and an estimated 84% of suspected domestic abuse or neglect cases are not reported by teachers. Similar studies suggest that this pattern of underreporting is not unique to the United States, but is a common trend in different parts of the world. And some of the reasons stated for underreporting in the study include fear that reporting will damage teacher-child or teacher-family relationships, fear of making an inaccurate report, fear that the reporting will escalate the abuse, or beliefs that inadequacies in the child protection system will harm the family or fail to actually help the child. So what I'm going to just say is adding national security agent to the list of detecting and identifying potential youth radicalization can feel at best bewildering and at worst ethically troubling. So when you look across, there's lots of research on, on extremism and youth radicalization. Tends to fall into three predictable buckets. The first is the security lens, so thinking kind of risk assessments and red flags, kind of the prevent duty. In Canada, we have kind of parachute programs where police come in and give them the 1 hour, like this will fix it kind of element. The cognitive model, equipping students to spot propaganda. So you'll see in terms of like looking at language, rhetoric, narrative, and elements in terms of cognitively to try to develop those capacities or knowledges. And then the protective instinct, limiting access. So a lot of people really worry about the increase in terms of social media and harmful online content. So basically how to put kids into bubble wrap in a different area. Now, what I'm suggesting, these approaches are not necessarily bad, but what I want to suggest that they have a limited role by themselves. And they're missing something crucial, I think. Young people are not simply passive recipients of risk. They are agents. They have questions, and they're trying to make sense of their world. And when they're not given a chance to do that openly, others will gladly step in. So here's the thing I want to explore with you today. What if we reframe this work? What if instead of approaching youth radicalization through the lens of surveillance and suspicion, we focused instead on empowerment, belonging, and critical engagement? What if the solution, I don't know if there's any solutions out there, what if we mitigate, let's say that, doesn't come from identifying at-risk youth that after they've started to disengage, but from building school cultures that make disengagement far less likely to begin with? So I'm talking about upstream things that we can do that are manageable. And here's the good news. I'm going to try to like elements of hope, right? And optimism in this talk. I'm not here to add something new to everyone's crowded place as educators, as researchers, as professors. What I'm going to argue is that this approach in the long run, I think, is easier and frankly, joyful. And I'm here to suggest that the best responses to radicalization actually align with what great educators are already doing. And you'll start to see a pattern, a theme here. What I think, teachers all have the capacity to create safe and inclusive classrooms. We have the capacity to encourage dialogue across difference, encouraging students to ask hard questions and listen generously to one another. And we have the capacity to give students a sense of agency and belonging. So let me just state this. This is not about more work. It's about reaffirming the work that matters most. So, I want to focus on what I've argued. I've kind of written about this over the last 25 years, off and on over the years as things pop up. But, what I want to focus on is a whole school approach to youth radicalization that has a foundation that advocates for intentional community building efforts that foster a sense of belonging and inclusion among all students. Specifically, I do agree with parts of the cognitive model and advocacy for formal curriculum that fosters the capacity for political deliberation and critical thinking. I think that's what good teachers do. Shifting the gaze from surveillance to empowerment, where peoples are not watched, but listened to, not monitored, but engaged with, not feared, but trusted. And that means creating the conditions for safety, agency, and empowerment among pupils. I do think that we need to consider the broader school culture. How we model this in our lived experiences, in our daily interactions, that allow for intentional community building efforts that foster a sense of belonging and inclusion among pupils. And then I have to just do the critical edge in terms of all the reductionist things that are all antithetical to some of these very basic principles that I think are the overarching aims and purposes of schools. Tendencies toward curriculum that reduces spaces for dialogue and deliberation. And in understanding this role, I think teachers and schools can what they can reasonably be expected to do, because we don't hold the burden here. I'm going to just shift briefly now to just kind of talk about the terms of youth radicalization and extremism. So lots of research from a number of scholars that look at the notion of youth radicalization, and how do people come into this process to becoming more extreme. What's interesting is that the factors contributing to this issue are multiple. There is no rubric or checkbox. There's no rubric, as long as I'm feeling like, oh, they have this and this and this, as are the prototypes of radicalized youth. So I kind of start, there's a few definitions. I start with this definition, this working definition, that youth radicalization is the increase in and reinforcing of extremism in the thinking, sentiments, and or behavior of individuals and or groups of individuals. And there's a subtle yet important distinction between youth radicalization and extremism. So youth radicalization emphasizes the process by which an individual youth or group or youth becomes more extremist. So it's that journey of getting to become extremist, whereas extremism is the current state of beliefs of an individual or group who has a particular perspective to the exclusion of other perspectives, or that strays from the norms and behaviors of mainstream society. In neither case does it necessarily refer to committing an actual act of violence. When there's an actual act of violence, that becomes terrorism. So extremists tend to use extremist methods, often in violence. Nor does it refer to any political, social, or religious movement. You can be on the left, you can be on the right, you can be up, you can down. Like, there are so many different versions of extremist groups. And so let's just focus on youth radicalization for a moment. The process, the journey to which an individual increasingly becomes extremist in nature through sentiments, thinking, or behaviors. There really are a lot of different ways, but so it's, on one hand, we don't have the checklist or the rubric, but there are some kind of common things that we might see despite the different personal journeys of how youth become radicalized. So there's kind of this tension here. So here's just a few. Some experience trauma in some way in their personal lives or in their communities' perspectives. Some feel perceived or real injustice. And this injustice often leads to a feeling of victimhood and indifference. Some feel disconnected, so a sense of isolation or being excluded and wanting to belong. Some seek validation, just to be heard, to feel what they're saying resonates with others. And then others, we have mental health and personality issues that that can be exploited by groups. There's elements. Others might have shared grievances, so injustice, oppression, socioeconomic exclusion, systemic racism, disadvantages, all the gamut here. Now, on the flip side, you have various kinds of extremist groups. And Qasim Qassam wrote this brilliant philosophical book called On Extremism that kind of does this full the principles, philosophical analysis of different kinds of extremists. So, he untangles various kinds of extremists. He says there's ideological extremists. And so if you think about ideologies, and they're guides to acting well as frameworks for understanding. One's ideology tells one what to do as well as what to think. So ideological extremists have a totalizing ideology or a very narrow ideology on one or more issues. So there's kind of that ideological, those frameworks of how they come to understand that are narrowed or just totalizing. There's no kind of compromise. You have a different group of extremists, which are the methods extremists, who use extreme methods. So however defined, it's commonly violence, but not always, to achieve their ends. So targeted violent attacks, you might think of hunger strikes, you can think of different areas, extreme methods in order to achieve their mandate. And Kassam talks about psychological extremists. And in this sense, the key thing with the psychological extremists is they lack a notion of moderation. So the way a person believes is an aspect of their psychology. So in the case of psychological extremists, it is those who believe uncompromisingly or fervently, like that, like, this is what it is, unwilling to revise their beliefs or consider the possibility that they might be wrong. And in this sense, it is extremist that entirely is a matter of how one believes. So it's a matter entirely of how one believes rather than just what one believes. Okay, so let's just break it down simpler. So we have extremist groups, they have aggrieved people, shared feelings of resentment, anger through grievance or oppression or injustice, whether it's real or perceived, which can feel and propagate the extremist principles. What's interesting with extremist groups, it's very, very rare that youths become radicalized on their own. They don't do this in isolation, but they do it in the social context of which groups are an essential component. So group dynamics also serve to legitimize the extremist mindset, and other members corroborate fringe perspectives and simultaneously discredit other relevant voices. There's a lot of psychological literature on extremists. And unfortunately, like you think about adolescent youth, right? Like I've just had 2 children coming out of teenage, like they're developing their frontal lobe, right? They're still kind of just figuring out, they're trying to get their cognitive capacities. So adolescents are particularly susceptible to groupthink that is pervasive in extremism. And unfortunately, again, with, if when you think about the development of the cognitive capacities and those years, right? A lot of psychological literature, because they're impulsive, they might not think through things as much. Adolescent youth may be more likely to carry out violent acts than adults, just because of some of the cognitive capacities that are still developing in those years. So as you can see, there is nothing here about particular faith groups or racial profiling. And in North America, at least, for example, the significant rise of youth radicalization is not occurring at the same rate with minoritized youth, but rather with the rise of white supremacist youth. So very similar studies in the United States and Canada. Between 2017 and 2022, the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism documented 67 domestic terror incidents by right-wing extremists in the United States. And white supremacists were responsible for more attacks than any other type of extremists in the past 6 years. So that included anti-government extremists, anti-abortion extremists, and other type of right-wing extremists, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, other militia groups, gunfighting, you name it. And during COVID, we saw this even in terms of ideological extremism, which were also targeted towards Asian communities. So part of the challenge, if you go back briefly to the notion of prevent duty, in terms of properly identifying those at risk, I'm going to wager a bet that most of the public do not think of their Caucasian boys as the potential of potentially becoming radicalized. It's not the first ones that people tend to think. When I've had conversations with Canadian colleagues and with British colleagues, the first person they think of someone who has become radicalized or extremist is rarely thought of as a white supremacist. And yet it's the fastest growing form of extremism. I want to sit with you this moment, this conversation that I had. And, I was asked to be part of an advisory expert board for the federal government in Canada, the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence. Part of the federal government's attempts to reduce youth radicalization in Canada and the roles that schools can play. And we're doing it just as poorly as you are. So same thing, right? Bring the police in, do the 1 hour, like, yay. It's like, don't drink, kids. Don't become radicalized, kids. Like, it's terrible, right? But I had a really good conversation with one of the directors when they had approached me to be one of the advisory board members. And we were discussing some of the criteria and the principles that I've developed over the years of my research. And she's largely agreeing, so I'm like, okay, that's good. But she said something to me that struck me profoundly. And I think it's worth sharing here for our consideration. So this director has had numerous conversations with former adolescents who became radicalized. And this is what the youth said to her in various forms. Most young people had legitimate concerns and worries. So whether that was climate change, lack of hope for the future, employment, immigration, these were actual legitimate concerns and worries. Whatever it was, legitimate concerns and worries. The second thing, they felt that they did not have a space or agency to voice these concerns. Third, teachers and parents did not listen to these concerns and brushed them off. And sadly, recruiters were very good at listening, validating their concerns, and then exploiting those concerns to distort them to the broader extremist ideology, whether it was racism, violence as a means to an end, whatever. This is something we can change. And simply listening and valuing young people's voices can be a powerful first step in reducing the number of youth who may be groomed by recruiters. It's what I would call low-hanging fruit, folks. And we're missing this very simple thing that we should be doing as adults. So with that, I want to move on to what I find manageable and hopeful and, basic, what what we do is talking about good pedagogical practice in thriving school communities. The first one at a fundamental level, and I do think there is, at a basic level, teachers can't simply refrain, like, I'm not going to talk about political deliberation. We're not going to talk about that. That's too hard. That's tricky. We have a collective responsibility to equip students with the dispositions and skills to navigate today's complex and challenging world. So lots have been written on political deliberation, and I could just spend a whole day on that, but I'll just do it very briefly here. We are thinking kind of on some various principles: inclusion, ensuring all voices, especially marginalized ones, are heard; reason giving, asking pupils not only to state their views, but to explain and justify them, talk through the rationale and judgments that come to those opinions and those decisions; respectful listening, requiring cultivating the ability to engage seriously with perspectives that differ from one's own; the critical reflection piece, questioning assumptions, our own and others, and examining issues from multiple perspectives; and then recognizing that there's a collective orientation that recognizes that deliberation is not only about individual opinions, but also working towards shared understanding, and at times, when possible, common ground. And finally, evidence-based judgment, weighing competing claims, interrogating sources, learning to navigate the complexities of information and misinformation. Now, one possible pedagogical tool, everyone's like, how are you going to do this? Like, what does it look like? So I'm going to try here. So is cultivating such deliberative capacities. It's one pedagogical way. There are multiple ways that we can embed political deliberation in our area, but I'm going to focus on this pedagogical strategy for the civic literacy folks out here, and the notion of counter stories or storying. Kassam contends, again, in his book on extremism, quote, counter-radicalization requires serious engagement with the arguments that extremists find convincing and devising of compelling counter-narratives. We need to kind of disrupt, create those moments, those logical inconsistencies in there. And people need to see themselves in these stories. So I want to suggest that the use of counter stories might be one approach as a pedagogical strategy here. So counter stories are narratives that challenge dominant or mainstream accounts of social reality. They often emerge from the perspectives of those whose voices are marginalized, overlooked, or silenced. And rather than accepting a single official version of history, as if we had the winners and losers, or the identity or experiences, something that we are trying to trouble and disrupt and tease out, and for students to see themselves in these stories, counter stories offer alternative viewpoints that expose inequalities, question assumptions, and highlight resilience and agency. Now, I'm going to say this is not relegated to the humanities educators out here, but this is something that is a collective responsibility. Here's a few examples. There might be better ones, but you can get an idea of what might look differently in the curriculum. So in literature, for instance, we might place Mallory Blackman's Noughts and Crosses along Shakespeare to challenge the traditional canon. In history, we might teach the Industrial Revolution, not just as a triumph of innovation, but also through the stories of enslaved people and migrant workers whose labor underpinned Britain's wealth. In gym class, we might highlight the Paralympians like Tanni Gray-Thompson or Marcus Rashford, whose activism on child food poverty tells a wider story of athletic influence. Or in maths, noting the contributions of Indian, African, and Mayan scholars who challenged the myth that math is solely a Western achievement. Or at a fundamental, every single one of us as an educator can simply invite pupils to reflect on their own family or community histories in relation to what is being taught, so they see themselves as part of the conversation. That's not it. You don't have to do the heavy lifting of the curriculum. You just need to ask them, what is this like for you and your experience and your family? In each case, counter stories offer one possibility for political deliberation. They make visible neglected perspectives, demand that students wrestle with complexity and cultivate a critical consciousness, awareness of one's own positionality and the systemic imbalances that shape society. And on this view, teachers and pupils share a responsibility to challenge common biases, bring to light structures of inequality, and imagine more just possibilities. There are so many examples, and you can talk amongst yourselves at the reception if you like, that are both less controversial to the morally highly political. So when I chat with pre-service teachers, they're like, I just want to learn maths. I just want to teach maths. I just want to get to the history. Like I don't want to do this, right? So you have to invite them to feel more comfortable in how do we create those ethical spaces for dialogue and deliberation, to interrogate disinformation, rhetorical language, and being more critically conscious. So this leads me to notions of respectful dialogue. So embracing dispositions of uncertainty, compromise, and nuance. Emphasizing the importance of fostering a culture of respectful, critical dialogue. What we're trying to do is create a learning environment that invites respectful dialogue and deliberation, so that they can develop the dispositions to weigh the evidence, understand the diversity of values and beliefs at play, and how they might shift depending on the emphasis from their own particular lived experiences, and being more apt to listen and consider alternative perspectives. And while they may not shift their view or change their perspective, what we're hoping is they have a bit more empathy, understanding to the different perspective. And so we're hoping to open up that ability to think beyond the limited, narrow view of oneself and their own perspective, and rather consider that all views do not hold an absolute truth, but are located in a particular time and place and highly contextual. And this disruption and interruption of the absolute narrow perspective compromises the radical use mandate, giving voice to students, simply letting students talk about the issues. What Paula McAvoy and Diana Hess, two American scholars, talk about in their book, The Political Classroom, contend is a strong determinant in creating more openness for political engagement and deliberation. Diana Mutz, also another scholar, suggests that not only does talking across political spectrums build civic discourse, a term she coins cross-cutting political talk. It creates more political tolerance among those from diverse perspectives. All right. Now, so we've got political deliberation. In such instances where we have entangled injustices that remain unresolved and ongoing, there is a further educational response worth considering, and that of restorative justice. Restorative justice calls upon individuals, institutions, and societies to formally recognize and acknowledge past atrocities and call for mechanisms for increased dialogue, reforms to promote reconciliation and mitigate conflict over the past. Ashton O'Donnell, who is an Irish scholar and did a lot of work actually after the Troubles, working with IRA political prisoners and trying to create spaces, has done really good work on this notion of restorative justice. And she contends that part of the uncovering of historical genealogies helped to make visible those who have been silenced. She states, quote, renewed honest conversations and reimagined curricula would ask how we can respond to and talk about violence in the broader lived context of students. And these conversations and curricula would find ways of including the voices of those who are pushed outside and beyond political consideration, unquote. Without naming a historical legacy that informs and fuels contemporary radical movements, the potential for groups to capitalize and draw upon a historical narrative as evidence that they have been silenced, humiliated, and shamed or wronged throughout history is compelling for a radicalized group or extremist group to recruit and mobilize. So for England, that may require noting its colonial past and the excessive military intervention in largely Muslim countries. And yes, this may require accountability that the truths hidden behind what we often talk as the British values have been sometimes, arguably often, unjust. Now, there's a parallel example. I don't want to just, I got dual citizenship, so I got to do the comparison for the Canadian, right? There's a parallel example, and not because in the case it's led to radicalization, but it does speak to naming truths that have been absent from Canadian curricula and in the conversations of Canadian citizens. So it was COVID. So in 2021, we had approximately 1,300 unmarked graves of Indigenous children that were found in the yards of residential schools. And it was national and global news, like all of these unmarked graves of these Indigenous children, so now we're talking about genocide in our residential schooling, not just the abuses that have been talked, but now we're talking about the extermination of peoples. So Canadians, the Canadians, I'll put in quotes, the Canadians were understandably shocked and horrified by this revelation when all these unmarked graves come, and we expect there's, thousands more in Canadian, and I'm going to say in the United States, they haven't got there, but I'm willing to wager they're finding unmarked graves, or they will, in the American residential schools as well. So, I'm a dean of a faculty, and I'm in a conversation with, I'm checking it's COVID. So first of all, there's, the connection's terrible, right? And belonging, we're all feeling, just discombobulated. So I reach out to a dear Indigenous colleague and friend of mine, and I just want to check in. And it's like, this is terrible. Like, how are you managing with this? And here's what she said to me. She goes, Dianne, we've known this for over 100 years. So for us, there is more anger and frustration, but not shock. We've known this all along. Canadians have not listened. They have not told this story. There has not been truth telling. So it is time for the truth to start coming out in order for us to heal and move on. And so when we look at former atrocities of genocide in Sarajevo, Rwanda, the Holocaust, we talk about what does it look like in those conversations of the reconciliation and the healing that needs to happen in terms of the dialogues and the lived experience and the traumas and the death. We have to kind of move into that space, and those are hard conversations. So again, I like to just capture because that's a lot to take in. So, nice summary that Snell and Lefstein provide here. What we're hoping for is pupils and teachers address authentic problems and play an active and agentic role in the joint construction of knowledge and negotiation of meaning. We want pupils to be empowered to express their voices, resulting in the interaction of multiple perspectives. We want pupils and teachers to adopt an open and critical stance towards knowledge claims. And we want the classroom community to be characterized by respectful and caring relationships and inclusive and reciprocal participation norms. So in this regard, I'm going to put it to you that these moments, these conversations, these teachable moments are responsibility of all of us. Spaces for a diversity of voices to come through, to allow their stories to be heard, to allow for space for dialogue and debate, and to deliberate in ways that allow for dissent and diversity through respectful conversation. Which leads me to the role of the school community. So 20 years ago, Dianne, I wrote a book on extremism back right after the terrorist acts of 9/11 and 7/7. And that whole book, it's good. It's in the cognitive model, political deliberation. Like we're going to focus on, troubling histories, being more specific. So kind of developing those critical capacities. But a few years ago, I kind of paused. I said, this is all fine if we talk about the formal curriculum and what happens in those conversations in those classrooms or in our lecture halls, that this all goes out the door if when the bell rings or the class ends or the lecture stops, the institution does not model this in the hallways and informal spaces and in the institutions where pupils and adults interact. And all too often, including my own children's school, there's an official espousal of upholding civic dispositions of respect and dignity and inclusion, only to see that when children are walking in the school or playing on the playground or field, that there's a bit of a blind eye turned by the adults when they see inappropriate behaviors that exclude, bully, or marginalize particular individuals. Now we have, again, in all of our school jurisdictions, various policies, anti-bullying policies, safe schools, whatever the term, they have kind of interesting overlaps. But it is critical for a whole school approach to reflect these principles in the daily lived experiences and in the policies and practices of our respective institutions. So what do I mean by that specifically? It means creating opportunities for meaningful connection and belonging among the student body, whether that be in assemblies, student councils, or forums, and the clubs that we allow for creating spaces for students to have agency and develop these capacities for empowerment. But conversely, it also requires an attentiveness to the microaggressions and not so microaggressions, just aggressions that occur, whether that's staff to staff, staff to parent, staff to student, or any combination therein. Now, I have to share an interesting moment. Years ago, there was this massive, large macro scale study in Canada. And it was called, the study was called, What Did I Do in School Today? And it was looking at student engagement or the increasing disengagement from the ages of 12 to 18. So each year that a student, was in school, the level of engagement went down from 12 to 18. And one of the principal investigators on the team told me, and she says, one of the most shocking things she had heard during this study was that they found that high school students, in Canada at least, had never once heard their first name being spoken by a teacher in the course of a week. Never once heard their first name being used by a teacher in the course of a week. Now, this is low-hanging fruit. Like we're talking about basic human connection and belonging, and we couldn't even do that. So how the school commits to and enacts a safe and inclusive learning environment is fundamental to anything that we can formally teach in our classrooms. Otherwise, I'll just say it. I think we're hypocrites and we're complicit. So here's another example in conversation again with the Canadian federal government on youth radicalization. And this director, poses to me, she said, there was an instance where there was an external guest speaker, because we're going to parachute in because teachers can't talk about this, but that's my rant off the side. I'll bracket that for a second. External guest speaker comes into the class to talk about gender-based violence. And as this guest speaker is giving the talk on gender-based violence in schools, he notices a pupil drawing a swastika on the desk. So he pauses and asks the child, why are you drawing this? Kind of basic question. And the child says, oh, no, it's nothing. It's a joke, like whatever. And after the presentation, the presenter lets the teacher know what had happened. And here's the teacher's response. It's a gray area. How is that a gray area? That was a missed learning opportunity or a conversation or a moment to talk, have a dialogical space there with the children, with the parents, with the school. And in this way, the teacher is complicit in not creating a safe or inclusive learning environment. So stating it candidly, when a swastika is brushed off as a gray area, we send a dangerous message that hate symbols can be normalized, that historical trauma is negotiable. And that is not neutrality, that is complicity. There's lots of daily examples that we see of this all the time amongst teachers, administrators. Children went to British schools, bizarre sometimes. When we brush off bullying or rough housing, they'll just figure it out. They're just the boys or these kids just like to stay in their corner and this corner. I'm like, not much we can do about it. I don't buy it. I don't think that's the right way. We are not modeling it in our lived daily experiences. So that is not simply good enough. We need to consider deeply the nature of our school community and our respective organizations and how that will impact the daily functioning of the school, as this will profoundly affect the atmosphere of the school and whether as educators we have provided a sense of safety, dignity, belonging, and well-being to all members of the school community. So as educators and administrators, we need to reflect on our student body and the families and communities that are in our schools. Do they feel like there are constant structural barriers that make them feel excluded or less valued? How do we help support families to see themselves as part of the vibrancy in the school so that their children are excited to walk in the school doors every day and be welcomed? And having a multicultural potluck is not going to tick off that box. It requires ongoing substantive conversations about how we live together despite our competing values, about the need to protect all pupils and particularly those who may feel vulnerable or isolated. So I'm going to conclude with this presentation by briefly making an overarching comment for if there's any policy analysts out there. Many educators and educational researchers may be listening and nodding in agreement, or partial agreement anyways, we'll get to that later, only to feel the weight of the impossibility of what is being asked of all of us. The curriculum, they might say, is already overflowing. I hear it all the time with student teachers. I hear it with in-service teachers, people who are in the field. And they're not wrong. Across many school jurisdictions, we're burdened with our programs of study with an ever-expanding checklist of outcomes, indicators, and standardized assessments, often at the expense of depth, deliberation, and relevance. And so what I'm asking for is not radical. In fact, it's profoundly human. We must make space for dialogue, for questioning, for students to locate themselves in the complexity of the world in which they're living. For young people to see that learning is not about memorizing answers or facts, but about participating in conversations that matter. And when we create a room in the curriculum for critical consciousness, respectful dissent, and civic engagement, we model what a healthy democracy looks like, and more importantly, what it feels like. This is really difficult when curriculum becomes reductionist, a race through content, crammed with dates, definitions, and disembodied facts. And in such environments, we reducing education to little more than a trivia contest. Ironically, one that students could just easily outsource to Google or generative AI. So for the educators and all of us here, let's carve out the cracks where you can. Those moments of debate, reflection, and re-encounter, they're not peripheral. It's what matters most. Encourage your students to ask whose voices are missing, who gets to decide what counts as truth, and invite them to wrestle with complexity, contradiction, and perspective. Because ultimately, our world, past and present, is shaped by ongoing struggle, not settled consensus. And if we want young people to be thoughtful citizens rather than passive consumers of information, we must cultivate these capacities and the time to see the world that way. So throughout this talk, I have been attentive to what I'm asking of teachers, administrators, and policymakers. For me, it really is not an add-on, but rather a recommitment to creating robust learning environments. And while schools alone do not bear the full responsibility for countering radicalization, I do believe that educators can move beyond fear or hesitation and embrace their role as facilitators of transformative learning by fostering an environment for students to be heard, have voice, and feel like they matter. Schools can empower students to navigate an increasingly complex world with empathy, criticality, and resilience. And in doing so, they not only reduce the risks of radicalization, but we create a foundation for a more just and humane society. Thank you. So this is where I start to get like, palms sweating because the hands are going up. Now I understand we have roaming mics. Do we have roaming mics? Otherwise okay. So at the very back, you were very first. So I'll let someone race to the mic so we can hear. I am hard of hearing. Yeah, I know, I see, but I saw her and then here, and then I saw in the middle, and then I have to look to make sure, because I want to make sure I'm modeling not exclusive behavior. So back, front, middle. So people are gonna get their steps in, and then I'll just do a scan.
Hi, Dianne. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm really grateful. I'll keep my question very short and sweet. And it's about the usefulness of the very word extremism, which I assume someone like you expected in advance. Now, I'm obviously not read in the literature of extremism like yourself or Kassam, and I was wondering whether you could justify or perhaps explain why you choose it, right? Because as a historian, it's very difficult to hear extremism and not think, well, there are many things that not too long ago were extremist beliefs that are now fine. You know, the slippery slope of a socially informed understanding of what extremism is. So, for example, manifest destiny is never taught as extremism, right? No colonial project was ever taught as extremism. And actually, the 2024 revised definition of extremism, the government in this country said was in response to the terrorist attacks on Israel. But, not 70 plus years of occupation, ethnic cleansing, and current genocide. That's not extremism. Does that castrate? Why not a word like empowerment, social justice? Why not through the positives, but on this word extremism, which so much has historically just served to uphold unethical power structures? Thank you.
Yeah. No. I see it slightly differently. So, and I really appreciate, first of all, the historical location and how we can exploit even the term of extremism to serve particular political or historical ends. On a pragmatic level, because it's being used in educational policy documents, I think there's an element of we need just to unpack the term. So for me, in terms of unpacking what are the principles of extremism, and I would say let's actually create it more actually a site of contestation about and how the notion of extremism actually can be played. Wouldn't that be a phenomenal conversation, as opposed to saying, and here is the government definition of extremism, right? And here is how it's actually serving a particular course, but it's a contested term, and politically and historically, that in itself actually should be unpacked. But I wouldn't shy away from it. I think we have to actually just start naming it, troubling it, interrupting it, pulling up the elements. And I think that's a more interesting conversation. Otherwise, and I could be wrong, right? We might be skirting the elephant in the room, right? Like, so if we don't actually name it and, and tease it out or unpack it or trouble it, I think that's just as problematic. So for me, I would say, no, let's do it. And let's have a conversation of how it's being used and the different languaging that's being used. And so, Kassam's book is great because, he does a phenomenal teasing of the principles and saying of the different ways But there are, the different principles in these different kind of extremist movements, and troubles it in the process there. But I think that's part of the educational task. I think part of it. So I don't know if that was helpful, but I actually no. Let's actually make that a site of contestation, as opposed to not doing it. So right down to the bottom, and then we got someone in the middle. Yes. This is like the Oprah Winfrey show now. It's now dated.
Thank you. Okay. I kind of was just interested, I think, in what you put up on that last slide about where radicalization has far less soil in which to take root. And while the radicalization of young people is worrying and is something that we should pay attention to, not brown boys and girls, but actually the skinheads and the swastikas are the ones which, as you said, was really scary. Even more scary is a radicalization of our government and our politicians. And I mean, of course, I have our wonderful Prime Minister who, informed us that multiculturalism has failed and that we're an island of strangers who, by the way, get married and have children, but nonetheless, that's where we are. And I kind of wonder how, we talk about legitimate concerns. I don't know that spending the front page of every newspaper talking to us about people coming over on boats when we know that's just a very tiny percent of the people are coming over. So it seems if young people are radicalized, there's got so much that feeds into that radicalization. It's not this around the edge thing. It's shouted at them, screamed at them every day from every public place that they can think of, including the people who are trying to de-radicalize them in policy terms. And I kind of wonder how that skews what you say, if it does skew it at all. I should have started by saying thank you, by the way.
Questions would be more interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can, do I think there's a worrying trend? I'm just neighbors to the south of the United States where they're really really on a mass scale. Radicalization, based on these kind of principles of the journey, narrowing ideology, totalizing ideology, more extremist perspective. So on a mass scale, we're seeing this in the United States. And I'm in Alberta, which, is now starting to make global news of all this ridiculous things that are happening in our province. Let's take an American stance. So one can be overwhelmed, but I still think the educative task is still manageable. We don't shoulder all the burden responsibility here, but we can just say, okay, let's, in the lived experiences, my children, we talk about genocide, and I think we need to give children and youth more credit than they deserve. Firstly, the most active youth and university students on Gaza has been from young people, not older people. They have been the ones who've been calling out the genocide in Gaza, right? So so I think part of it, you can pull out, and it's the same kind of a task in terms of the rhetorical language and the way in which propaganda is being, manipulated. The students, you can guide them with the principles of how we do this. But I actually think it's there. What we need to do is allow them to actually talk about it. Well, what does this mean for you? When we see the pages, so if you're pulling up different news items on, or it was on BBC, there was something about the number of refugees coming on boats, and stuff that hasn't changed for 25 years. Pupils want to discuss that. And we can help provide, what is your lived experience? What does that look like for you? What are the judgments being made in terms of, what are the contested issues? You can unpack that. So I think you can, in some ways, leverage it in different ways. I was in Tokyo and I went to the most bizarre museum that no leader went to. It's like the Imperial War Museum. And people are like, oh no, that's a terrible one, because they were giving the justification for Pearl Harbor. I'm like, awesome. I want to go see from the lens of the imperialists of why they thought the justification of bombing Pearl Harbor was interesting, and the propaganda and the rhetoric. we can do that from as educators and use that to say, listen, this is actually real lived experiences that are happening. What are the different ways? What might be other perspectives? How do we know the judgments are made? So we can develop these lesson plans and talk about what does it look like, and what does it look like for your family? What does it look like for your community? Are you part of that community? If you're a newcomer or a refugee, so we can give some empathy. So I'm ramble because you were talking first about governments, in terms of the move towards extremist ideology. I think what we do as educators is manageable. We keep on doing it, recognizing that this is a phenomenon that's playing out on a large scale in many contexts around the world. So I don't know if that was helpful, but they're here, and then we got at the back, in the middle, there. So one, 2, 3, just checking.
Hi, thank you as well for bringing this up, and fits in nicely with the presentation we had earlier this morning from Marlon. But I was really touched by your story about your Indigenous friends.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine what went through that community when they said, we're not shocked, we're hurt, but we're not shocked because they knew this all along. I just feel that really really hits home, because you've mentioned Bosnia, you've mentioned the Holocaust, which we were not witnesses of, but we are witnesses of as historians, as readers, as educators, and passing this message on to our young people, whether at school or university. But now we are in a different era where we actually are witnessing it. So you talk about healing after it happened, and 100 years after, discovering these graveyards. They were unmarked, but at least they, and I don't mean in any way to be disrespectful, but there are some graveyards. What we're witnessing now, there are none, and they are unnamed. And how can we heal from that? As I'm not saying as educators, I'm saying just as humans. In terms of radicalization, I can see how young people, ethnic minorities, people who are othered, how they are distancing themselves, because this, like the earlier question about extremism, about terrorism, has been reframed. We've just seen arrests of people because another group has been classified as an extreme group or terrorism. So the social definition keeps changing. So I'm just wondering, how can we then as educators heal, or even start thinking about heal after, while we are in the moment and witnessing it and not actually reading about it?
It's a great question. Yeah. In the context, and in particular, so let me speak to Gaza, right? I'm not sure there's healing yet. And so part of me says, are people being heard? Are they being affected in their lived experience? What we don't, like one of the criteria, I hate that word. One of the principles that we think about in terms of radicalization is injustice, grievance, oppression. And the nervousness is when it moves towards victimhood or indifference. Indifference is the part that I get most nervous about. We want to keep it human. So let's have a humanizing conversation about what is occurring, right? So the silence is more problematic. And I would say that from any, I'm a professor in Alberta, and we're just north of Montana. So I have very diverse student populations, right? I'm just, who do I worry about? Obviously, I worry about the students who are directly or indirectly affected by what's happening in Gaza. I worry about the anti-Semitism of my Jewish students. I worry about, and this will be provocative, and I'm going to get like another 100 hands. This is probably where I'm going to get like, this is where I went off course. I do worry when I have some colleagues who's saying, this is a safe space. We will not do Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-LGBTQ. Because I worry about the right-wing extremists, the Proud Boys and Oath Boys, who I also have in my class, who become silenced in their own corner, and we're entrenching their narrative that they have been oppressed by all this diversity, right? So how do we craft spaces that we can actually interrogate, and invite them in conversations and create moments of interruption or pause? And so in issues, so going back to the healing, I think first of all is for people to actually have a voice, right? And to be felt and to say, we're angry, we are hurt, the world is not listening. So there needs to be a sense of validation of what people are deeply experiencing from their lived experiences, whether directly or indirectly, in cases of what is occurring in the world today. So that's part of it. The healing part, I think we got along. I don't think we're there yet, but I want to create the space to allow for the voices to say, this is what it means for me and my family and my community, and this is what's happening in a different context as different people are coming to hear about this issue and the different values and beliefs and trauma that's happening during that. So we're not going to resolve it, but we need a space. We can't just keep it quiet. That part is challenging. And, like I'm a senior leader, so, in our institution, I don't envy the presidents and vice chancellors of any institution of navigating all the complexity. But, I think there have been better and worse ways that people can do it. And we're starting to see that out in terms of how people are grappling with the kinds of spaces we need on our campuses. Thank you. I saw there was somebody here, and we got, you have to cut me off at some point, but I'm so sorry. I want to make sure we get around. I might want to do it. Yeah, let's get in that corner because I see you.
Thank you so much, Diana. It's been really stimulating and thought-provoking talk this afternoon. So I'm very grateful to you for that. Do you know Kathleen Fincham? She's from Winnipeg, and she was a former colleague of mine, and she took great interest in the Middle East and the condition of the Palestinians, and she's written many papers on that subject. And if you do come across her, my name is Fincham, and we used to call each other cousins, although we could never trace where our
Relatives in spirit.
it's the question is coming back to the remark about extremism, the word terrorism too. I've heard a conversation fairly recently about how difficult the word terrorism is to pin down, and whether at all it can be defined accurately, because somebody mentioned that if we were talking about terrorism, we might even categorize Nelson Mandela in his early days as a terrorist, and I think he may have been described in that way. So I'm empathetic to what you're saying, because I know this is a very difficult area to try to express and to explore. But I just wanted to, because counter-terrorism is there, whether you could have a comment on the use of that word. Thank you.
Yeah, most of these terms are problematic, right? But I don't know, maybe it's the philosopher in me, right? Let's not erase those terms. Let's provoke them. Let's make it contested sites. And I actually think there's something more interesting underneath those terms, as opposed to saying, because it's problematic, we're just gonna push it to the side. I actually think let's trouble it. Let's talk about where is, the etymology and the sites of contestation, how it's been exploited, how it's been manipulated. That's a much more interesting conversation, as to say, because it's problematic, we're going to take it out of our lexicon. No, let's talk about it. That students would eat it up, right? Like pupils are like, that's really cool. Like, I've got a 7-year-old boy who's like totally into this, right? And he's like, oh my God, have you noticed what's happening today, right? Like they're not bored with this conversation. They want to talk about this and they want to think. And I'm like, okay, what are the judgments? Do you think, what did it look like? Do you see what happened in the newspaper? Like, that's all we're doing is a basic way for students that it's real and authentic and that they have a part of that conversation. So they see themselves as part of the conversation. They of what that conversation is and help them, support them to saying, okay, but what are the principles? Have you thought about this? And like, oh, that's interesting. Like, oh, maybe let's pull from here. We're just providing those mechanisms to help to develop, cultivate those capacities and those dispositions of how to navigate, as opposed to them sitting in a basement in a social media. That's terrible. Let's do it out. Let's have this conversation here. So they're all troubled. There's counter-radicalization, which is upstream. There's de-radicalization once they become radicalized, and we'll get them off to be less radical, less extremist. And there's different versions, right? I say keep the language in, make it contested, keep on amending it. The philosophers say I can recant it and do something better next time when I've slipped. So, but I don't know if that helps. But that would be my answer is no. Let's stop. The erasure of language is problematic in my mind because it's there. It's out there in the literature. So let's not erase it in our lexicon ourselves. Okay, I feel bad because this group has been neglected. You've been so patient, yeah. So wave your hand because Oh, you got it. Okay, good. You're 1, 2, and then 3.
So thank you for your talk. I'm wondering if actually there's more of a case for creating more soil for radicalization to take place, because when we're talking in classrooms, that's great. When we're encouraging teachers to not be frightened of impartiality guidance and state silencing, that's also great. But I think making children active citizens and actually radicalizing children so they understand what action they can take and the limits and the dangers and the empowerment that they can use in order to take action, because we're very passive. We're all watching a genocide and we're all tutting and saying, if only.
Yeah.
But how many people are actually tackling that in their classrooms and taking children to take action?
No, I have not thought about that. I'll give you a poor response, which I feel like that's a trend right now. It's a hard topic, right? Like we're all grappling with this. When I was invited with the symposium and I first talked about the whole school approach, I kid you not, and dear colleagues that we've worked and debated over the years, like for 20 years, the American scholars and the Australian scholar, they looked at me and they said, this is ridiculous that you're asking for a whole school approach, like focusing on the school community. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm like, but this is like low, like, I'm like, this is easy. And they're like, and so it made me pause. I'm like, oh, you're right. And I'm like, this seems to be like, I'm kind of in my comfy chair saying, and we should do this as a whole school make sure it's embedded in our policies and practices, include the parents. And the American scholars said, that's ridiculous. Because the parent councils have become so unsafe in the American context that it will undermine any element of political deliberation or safety or well-being in the schools. And so I'm thinking with it's why we do these international symposia, because you start thinking, as the Canadian, I'm like, I can't imagine if I don't bring in the Indigenous parents and communities and elders into the community as, nothing about us without us. They have to be part of the conversation. So then it became a conversation there. So it's interesting because, my work was always on just formal curriculum. Like, how do we do political deliberation? How do we create critical dialogue? What are the mechanisms to try to trouble narrow ideologies? And then I'm like, okay, well, what does it look like in terms of the policies and practices in schools? I have not thought beyond the borders, but I'm going to take that away as a reflective in terms of what are the implications of that, because half my colleagues thought the whole school approach was radical itself, and they're like, that's ridiculous. So that was the site of contestation. But I like it in terms of we're not passive enough. So what does it look like to become an active agent citizen in, you know, times of humanitarian crisis and genocide and global crises? I think that would be a hard sell, I would think, in school jurisdictions. Like, I think this is a hard sell, never mind, just to create an ethical space for dialogue and deliberation, which, you know, seems like the basic aims and purposes of schools in my mind.
Thank you. I want to start off by saying incredible speech and all the incredible questions. You've answered them so well. I am not envious. I do not wish to be you at this moment. I do wish to have your clarity and sentiment. I hope my question's a little less hard-hitting, but I think you touched upon it a little bit in the last couple of slides. But when you talk about the responsibility educators have to sort of navigate these very difficult conversations and help students understand, be able to sit with this idea of different awful things happening and somehow still be able to interact with a very diverse society. I wonder do you think there is any way we can leverage the incredible amount of technology and AI that we have to in any way enhance those conversations, or do you think that this has to be a purely human social interaction?
Interesting. I could see, I always give my nod to civic literacy scholars who always unpack language and power structures. You know, as an assistive technology, as a mechanism to critique. I haven't thought about it much, but or to combat the social media of what it looks like and the algorithms that are happening. And my mother, like, I live this. Like, we start talking about our family experiences. My mother-in-law, like, oh my gosh, she's anti-vaxxer and QAnon, and I'm like, oh my gosh, how did you get to be a socialist to QAnon in like 3 short years of COVID, right? And I don't know where I was going with that, other than my mother-in-law. We have very hard family conversations. But that's what it was. It was the algorithms, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the social media that you're getting. So, there's a scholar, C.Tai Nguyen, that I came across, and she talks about this notion of epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. But we're all most of us are all guilty of this. And see, now I got the 5 minute or the 1 minute. We're a
Little bit subtle.
We all do this, especially if you're like a Gen Xer like me who has Facebook. And we're like, I'm going to delete that person because, oh my gosh, that's like a Canadian. I'm going to delete this one who's Trump, and I'm Albertan. So like I'm deleting my Facebook pages all the time, right? Given all the kind of crazy. But that's problematic, just as the other extremists are. So I've kept some, and it kills me. And I actually deleted my mother-in-law, I kid you not, during COVID. But I put it back on because I'm like, no. Like, I'm talking about disruptions and interruptions. So are there ways, right? So we can talk about this long-winded question. We can talk about algorithms and how, and the use of social media and algorithms. We can use it as assistive technology. We don't have to come up with all the hard things. You can ask in terms of, given the political context, what are some of the political strifes, using, approved curricula in X jurisdiction. What are the different rhetorical language used in this political context? What are the political contestations and that have led up to led up to Afghanistan? What are the political historical things in Gaza? You don't need to be doing a PhD. AI can help support, with a keen eye, to help support there. So do I think AI has a role to play? Yeah, just like everything done well as assistive technology, defining the parameters of approved guidelines or text and whatever. It's helpful.
I think time is nearly up. I think we could keep on talking about this all evening, but let's move across and do it with perhaps a glass in our hands. Thank you for attending. Thank you for your questions. And thank you to Dianne.